It's wonderful to be here at the Yale Art Gallery talking about Vincent Scully. It does feel a little bit like traveling to Florence to talk about Michelangelo or to Charlottesville to talk about Thomas Jefferson. The connection between Vincent Scully and this room is particularly potent, of course, since so many of us remember his regular lectures here. But it does not end with these walls. It really extends across all of New Haven, since we can't truly separate Scully from this city where he was born, where he grew up, and lived almost all of his life. Even when we talk of his work in Greece that yielded the earth, the temple, and the gods, or his work in the American Southwest, the presence of New Haven is somehow always there, always shaping his thought, always framing the questions. I'll come back to New Haven and its impact on Scully in a moment. But the other most important thing to say about Vincent Scully, the overarching thing before we even begin to get into what he achieved as a scholar and a teacher, what he stood for and what his legacy might be, is to say that he seemed, if you look at it in broad strokes, to fit no established pattern. He was a townie who went to Yale, a student of literature who made his life within the visual world, a scholar who was also an activist, an academic who was driven by passion, a public man who was most comfortable in private, a sophisticated man of the world who often found his greatest love in the plainest and most familiar things. He was the politest man you could ever meet, except when he was rude. He was a lover of institutions, yet a skeptic about political power. He exuded authority, and yet he distrusted authority. He was a man whose reputation came in part from the brilliance and power of his ability to perform on the lecture platform, yet he nevertheless approached each lecture with trepidation and fear of failure. All of this adds up to what might seem on the surface to be a bundle of contradictions, and indeed it is. But it is only by looking at all of it and seeing all the elements of Scully, not as simple contradictions, but as more of, if I may say, indications of a complex and difficult whole, that we can begin to understand him. Now, this very phrase, indications of a complex and difficult whole, sounds, as I say it, more than a little clinical, and I suspect that Vince would loathe hearing it. Not because he would say it was wrong, but because the phrase has such an analytical quality about it. Trying to explain Vincent Scully by methodically dissecting the contradictions inherent in his persona is the antithesis of Scully, the ultimate un-Scully-like way to try to understand him. It is only a little closer to reality than if we were trying to explain him by saying he was X feet tall and weighed X pounds. It is bloodless, and that is the very opposite of what Scully was. He was full of passion, visible passion, which he not only felt, but could communicate more effectively, more convincingly, more powerfully than any scholar I've ever known. If anything characterized Vincent Scully, it was not his ability to feel passion, it was his ability to convey passion, to make his students feel what he was feeling, or better still, to make them feel so engaged with what they were looking at, that they would be inspired to find ways to feel these things on their own. Inspired by Vincent's passions for architecture and art, to begin to have passions of their own. And yet still it would be a terrible mistake to think of Vincent Scully, for all that we associate him with passion, as a historian driven primarily by emotion and instinct. That's been a criticism of him from some academic quarters throughout his career, the notion that it was emotion and not intellect that shaped his views. That sells him short. It denies him the brilliance of his eye, the sharpness of his judgment. The ultimate contradiction in his persona, perhaps, was the extent to which he was rigorous, tough-minded, unsentimental analyzer of form for his entire life as a scholar, even as he was also refusing to engage in what we might call form-based scholarship, even as he was saying that meaning was not to be found wholly in form itself, but in the relationship of form to social, cultural, political, and psychological realities, to the concerns that drive any humanist. And whatever else can be said about Vincent Scully, he was a humanist above all else. The architecture historian Michael Lewis observed in an elegant essay written after Scully's death that while Vince's heroes changed over time, from, and I quote, from Wright to Le Corbusier, to Louis Kahn, to Robert Venturi, and finally to Douani and Platter-Zyberk, what might seem at first glance to be unprincipled fickleness was in fact an expression of consistency on the part of Scully, who always identified himself with what he felt to represent the most humanist direction of architecture at any given moment. That, I think, is the truth about him that matters, that he was a humanist above all, and that if he seemed inconsistent, it was really a response to changing conditions in the world itself, conditions to which he was, throughout his life, exquisitely sensitive. Another way to say all this would be to say that for Scully, no work of art, no work of architecture ever existed outside of social and political and cultural context. And of course, these contexts change and shift constantly. It could not be otherwise. The world continually changes, and in Scully's view, it is the job of the art historian not to analyze the object in isolation from the world, but in connection to it. So as the world continued to change, Scully's view of what any single work of architecture was, or what the career of any particular architect meant, or exactly how one interpreted the mission of creating a humane and socially responsible architecture, inevitably read differently against a different context. Before we step back and talk a bit more chronologically and geographically, looking at Scully's life and work with particular attention to its connection to New Haven, let me make one final general observation, which also falls into this category of seeming contradictions. The point is this: Scully was a historian of the visual arts who was working just as much in the realm of language, an art historian who, for all the sharpness of his eye, was deeply interested in the English language and what it could do, what it could mean to connect to art. How, in other words, we could use the verbal to enlighten us about the visual. Now, of course, all art history is verbal. Every art historian uses words to describe images and make judgments about them and about their significance. So what made Scully different in this regard? The more I look back at Scully's famous lectures, a handful of which, thankfully, have been preserved on film, and the more I look back at his writing, the more certain I am that the thing he really reveled in thinking about purely in terms of form wasn't architecture, it was language. He all but tells us this in that fine checkerboard film about him, in which, recalling his beginnings as a student of literature, says, "My culture was all the word. I majored in English." And then goes on to say, when he moved on to the history of art, "I could use language about something that wasn't language." Use language about something that wasn't language. Yes, And what really drove Scully was the Greek principle of ekphrasis, the use of rhetoric or literary form to describe works of art. The very foundation of his career, we might say, was this concept, which begins to tell us why Scully played with the English language with a precision that went beyond clarity of communication and into the form-driven act of making poetry. He deconstructed and reconstructed words, making phrases and sentences on the basis of rhythms and sounds and associations, as a poet might. Another way to say this would be to say that I don't think he fully wanted to leave literature when he moved on to art and architecture. That's partly because he was frustrated by the limits of the new criticism, which in some ways is to literature what a purely form-based analysis of art is to art history. I think it's fair to presume that Scully experienced literature as more empathetic, as connected to feeling as much as form. And my sense, looking back at the whole of his career, is that he saw in art history and architecture an opportunity for his instinctively empathetic viewpoint to be expressed more freely than it could in the world of literary teaching and criticism. Now, he was, of course, driven by an obvious and deep love for architecture and art, and by the discovery that he responded to them and had plenty to say about them. It was hardly a random choice to move away from literature to art and architectural history.